Why are oceans so important to our planet, and what can we best do to protect them? Kia ora, I'm Dan Breen. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Science at Auckland University of Technology, and welcome to Ocean Matters. The first question that we have is something that gets bandied around quite a lot, and that's, is it true that space is better explored than our oceans? And that's kind of a tricky question. It is true that we have only about 20% of our oceans mapped using sonar, which is a fairly remote way to do it. But we have pretty close to 100% of the surface of the Moon and Mars mapped, for example. Much less has been actually observed from camera or directly by humans on scuba or in bathyscapes and so forth. And in fact, most of the maps that you see around the world and around New Zealand, which are all coloured in with different depths or other variables, are basically interpolated or scientifically guessed from sample points which might be hundreds of kilometres apart. So our view of what's on the bottom of the ocean is extremely limited. Even in the Hauraki Gulf and the North Island, we've spent the last 20 years trying to collate data and encourage people to conduct more surveys because we know so little about what we need to protect. So our second question today is one that's also constantly debated, is ocean pollution or overfishing worse? And again, another complex question, and an answer is that it's probably more a combination of a number of things, more of a death by 1,000 cuts. Habitat destruction, overharvesting, introduced species, pollution, which includes global warming, because CO2 and methane are a form of pollution in this context. And there are also, these things can actually work together and have cumulative impacts and also interactive effects that are difficult to predict with feedback cycles and things like tipping points where everything looks like normal for years and then suddenly it changes into a whole new ecosystem. Here's a good one on some recent research that's been done in the Hauraki Gulf, and that's on the historic effects of humans on snapper in the Hauraki Gulf, and that's from fishing and pollution and other sources as well. And some recent research at AUT by Professor Armagan Sabetian has basically compared the rings in fish otolith ear bones that have been found in Maori middens going back to the 1400s, 1400 AD, with the ear bones from snapper that have been caught in modern day at Long Bay and Omaha. And what they found was that the pre-industrial or pre-European and Maori fishing, juvenile snapper spent a lot more time in the upper parts of estuaries and so forth, whereas in modern times they tend to be further down the estuary and out to sea. And we think this may be a reflection of the amount of sedimentation and pollution in fresh water and so forth. And they've been able to do this through looking at the different ratios of elements like strontium, barium and calcium within the ear bones of the fish, which have little rings in there each year, which can tell you a lot about the climate they've lived through. And there are other animals like corals that we can do this with too. Another question that we hear about quite often is, how are orange roughy doing? They're well known for the very high catches in the 1970s, which rapidly declined in the 80s and 90s. And now they're managed very, very closely. In fact, at the end of last month, a public process was accepting submissions on alternatives to cut the total allowable catch for between 20 and 40% or even 60%. And in some areas, close areas to orange roughy fisheries as well. But recovery is a slow process, and with a fish that doesn't breed until it's 20 to 30 years old, this could take quite a long time, and the remaining biomass is only a small proportion of what was originally there. So this question addresses one of the long-held myths that fish don't feel any pain, but they certainly do, and that's why we have ethics. We require ethics committee approval for any research that we do on fish, or even on crayfish and lobsters. And these animals have very complex nervous systems and brains and behaviours, and they feel pain, and they have very sensitive skin with lateral lines that can even detect small vibrations in the water. So it's important to actually take note of this. And though it's difficult in large industrial fisheries, recreational fishers will often adopt methods that limit the amount of damage that they do to the fish, particularly ones they intend to release, but also the ones they keep. A really important question at this time is how well protected are New Zealand seas? And at the moment, less than 1% of our mainland ocean are protected within marine reserves, and only a slightly larger amount of that in what have been considered as MPAs, usually cable zones or a couple of fisheries areas. Now, New Zealand is party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's signed up to a framework that includes a target of 30% of our area of oceans in protection by 2030. And we're a long way off that. On the offshore islands like the Kermadec and the subantarctics, we have greater than 50% protected, but on the mainland, we have only about 0.4% of the area of our mainland waters within 12 nautical miles in marine reserves, and only about 1.4 in total, including other things like pipeline zones. In the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone, we have no legislation at all to create marine reserves whatsoever. We only have fisheries closures and some so-called benthic protected areas proposed by the fishing industry, which are far too deep to trawl and with limited biodiversity value. In other places in the world, for instance, in Australia has 50% of their waters in marine protected areas in general, and that includes 20% of Australia's waters in no-take marine reserve type areas. And this is increasing around countries throughout the world. And New Zealand was once the leader in marine conservation, and we probably know more about monitoring marine reserves, but have done relatively little to implement them, even though we have enormous amounts of science here on this topic. One really popular topic, and this question addresses this, is why coral reefs are so important and how can we best protect them. Tropical reefs are among the most diverse in species and productive ecosystems in the world, and they provide food and shelter and income, particularly through tourism, and coastal protection for millions of people throughout the tropics. They are also larger than life canaries in the mine, and increasingly frequent coral bleaching occurring throughout the world over huge regions is a really significant indicator of the effect of global warming on our oceans. And how do we best protect them? The best way, of course, is within no-take marine reserves. And these are the only types of reserves amongst all the different sorts of marine protected areas that have actually shown to have some benefits to the fish stocks within them and to surrounding areas. We also need better fisheries management and management of our terrestrial land use, such as runoff from sediment and so forth, and particularly management of CO2 emissions and methane emissions, and particularly ocean acidification could even go one stage further in terms of loss of thousands of different habitats and hundreds of species. Another question I have, and it's probably the most difficult one, is my favorite animal, and I also like plants as well. I tend to dabble in a lot of things. I've worked with marine mammals, but also with zooplankton, but a lot of my work has focused on hard corals, and they are my favorite animal, not just because of the amazing ecosystems they provide, but their diversity and complexity of structure is almost unparalleled, I think. Oh, and another question I've got is whether I get seasick. And I haven't been seasick for a very long time, but I do get seasick, and I think it's just a matter of how big the seas are and the conditions at the time. And the best thing is basically to stay outside, or even better, drive the boat if the skipper will let you, is a good way to take your mind off feeling sick. So a really important and controversial question at the moment is, do I support a ban on bottom trawling? And I do support a ban on any type of destructive fishing, and trawling is amongst the most destructive fishing method there is, particularly on areas that haven't been fished. There are claims from fishers in some areas that the area has been trawled so long that it is basically trawl ground, and doesn't exist as its original habitat, but I do know that habitats do recover, sometimes slowly, but sometimes quite rapidly, and all we have to do is basically stop the damaging practices, and there's very little work to do after that. So the next question is also very controversial, and is why are sharks so important? Now, sharks are what they call apex predators. They head towards the top of the food pyramid, if you like, and they have a quite strong controlling influence on other species below them in the food web, particularly in controlling medium-sized carnivores and herbivores that would otherwise perhaps overgraze areas or even overhunt smaller fishes as well. There are even some areas where sharks have been fully protected, where there are more sharks at the top of the pyramid than there are actually fish at the bottom of the pyramid. They've actually inverted the pyramid. So one of those places is Whakarava in Tahiti, where there are up to 500 reef sharks in this pass, which you can dive with. And once a year, there's a spawning aggregation there of 15,000 camouflage groper, which the sharks have a bit of a feast on for one night of the year as well. And that's all within a marine protected area established by the United Nations originally and managed by the French Polynesian government. So the biggest question of all that we got was, is it too late to save our seas? And the answer is absolutely no. And to do it, it's more about managing our own behavior. It's not about managing the ocean or the fishes. In many cases, it's simply about stopping or at least decreasing damaging practices. And the ocean has a remarkable ability to recover very, very quickly. It's only a matter of us changing our behavior that is more important. Thanks for watching Ocean Matters, and I hope this has increased your knowledge of how important our oceans really are.